All right. Okay, American Lit, if I could have your focus, that would be lovely. Looks like most of you have already opened up week 3. When I said that, a lot of you went and did it. That's lovely as well. So today, I get to start Unit 4, The Great Gatsby, with you. I say get to because I'll tell you my bias right away. This is one of my favorite books of all time. It has so much fun stuff in it. There's bootleggers, there's a dumb affair, there's drama, there's gossip, there's people acting a complete foolish mess, and personally, I enjoy that. You may not, and it's absolutely okay if you don't like the book. You can still complete your work for it and examine it. In fact, in the past, when students haven't liked The Great Gatsby, I've encouraged them to be specific as to why. So they were still able to pick out the work and get a good grade. That's what I suggest for you. For many of you, I think if I have your English classes correct in order, it's been a bit since you've had to read an entire book. So I will be modeling a lot of this. I will be giving you a lot of answers. I should let you know offhand right away, I am not the kind of English teacher that likes trick questions. I hated that in school. When I read this book in school, I literally had a question on a quiz. It was like, on page 54, what important dialogue takes place? I'm like, I don't remember. Who walks around remembering what page something happened in a book? It would have been better if she had said, talk about some important dialogue in the book. So I try to make all your questions very open-ended because one of the great things about English is you and I can have a different opinion and both be right as long as we back it up. I like that. All right, so we're going to start with background on the book and how it connects to modernism, and then we're going to do the first part of chapter 1 together. Let me show you how this looks on your week 3 handout. So this is the part of our points this week that's formative. So I'm going to scroll past task 1. That was where you hopefully wrote your paragraph yesterday. And if you didn't get a chance, I would do it today. Many of you could use some help grade-wise. That's where you're at. All right, so here's what you're going to be asked today. Things to look out for. First thing you're going to be asked. First thing is, what are 2 of the most important or most interesting things according to you about modernism? And just like usual, I'm not looking for a complete sentence here. I'm looking for enough to show that you get it. That's the goal. So you'll come up with 2 things you think are the most important or interesting things about modernism. I did have a student last year who asked if he could write questions here instead. You absolutely can do that as well. So if when I'm teaching you things and you have to write things, if you have a question, write it right there. That way you get points and I will always answer it. Second thing we're going to look for today when we start chapter 1 is exposition details. So these are things like, what do we learn about the setting, the protagonist, that's the main person in the book, and the point of view, who tells the story. Notice you get a choice here as well on what 2 exposition details you want to focus on. Then we're going to meet some of the first characters in this book. So for each character, I'm going to have you write 1 detail about them and why you chose it, and then a second detail and why you chose it. So our first character is going to be Daisy Buchanan. And one good thing about this book is the main characters, it's really clear who's important. And I'll only ask you questions about characters that are important. All right. Your next one is going to be 2 details on Tom Buchanan and why you chose it. So last year, one popular answer was he's kind of a jerk. And then I chose it because I noticed it right away. And like I said, I will give you free answers at the end of the hour. So once we go through this, I will go through and model some of these for you. And then here, we'll pick up tomorrow, or pardon me, Friday's lesson, because Thursday you have a work day. So Friday we'll pick up with historical details. What facts about Fitzgerald made you wonder or do you think were the best? And then we'll continue with character details. So that's how that looks for today. Let's actually teach you the things so you can write them down. Okay, so we reviewed yesterday how to do an academic paragraph. Here's where we're at. So first off, a couple of tips for reading this book. If you struggle with reading, I know I was a kid who did at your age. I would really suggest that you either follow along when I read it, or there's about a million versions of this online. Books on tape, that kind of deal, audiobooks. It works best if you use these with the actual text. One of the things I did for my master's degree was I learned about reading, how to help people with it. And one of the main things scientists have found is that if you are hearing the words you're reading, your reading level jumps way up because your brain syncs up and absorbs the words. So that I strongly suggest to you. So if when we're reading, I see headphones as people are using audio as they go, that's good. That's a good strategy. The other thing you should know, a lot of times students will Google an answer and then paste it. I don't think Googling is a bad thing. I think it's smart to use whatever resources you have to get an answer. You just have to make sure you say where you got it. Use a text citation. So according to sparknotes.com, the Great Gatsby, blah, 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 blah. Okay? So that's a smart strategy. I don't consider that cheating. All right. You won't also, how sometimes in English classes they have you do a reading log? For every day you decide what to write and what page you got to. We're not doing that. Any question I gave you, I'll give to you up front. Typically, I find those don't help students very much. It's more busy work, and I'm not interested in giving you busy work. All right, and I would also suggest approach the book to generally get it. There are parts of this book that you probably won't get. It was written at a time that has very different English from ours. So some of the slang, if you're like, what does that mean? You can either ask or move on. You just have to get the general gist. You don't have to know every single thing in this book. As per usual, I've included some resource links for you in Schoology. If you need to watch a video to get your answers this week, you can do that. Okay, so let's teach you about modernism. These are the parts where you'll start writing on your handout. So this is a review. So modernism, just like for the Harlem Renaissance, same kind of literary group. So this was not only a philosophical movement, but it was also artistic. So in other words, writing and painting, that kind of thing. One of the things that's different in modernism from the other things we've read is it's not as positive at all. If you find a lot of the messages are like, wow, the message in this book is that people are awful. Yeah, that's very modernism. They also believed because they had been through 2 world wars and a Great Depression, a lot of the people in modernism, understandably, didn't see life as a sunny thing. In fact, they thought life had lost its meaning. They wrote many times about how teenagers of this generation are a wasted generation. Like they're completely lost. Nothing will happen good with them. They also believed that men and women were isolated from one another. That because of our gender roles, men and women didn't connect very well. Okay, 2 things they believe. Traditional ways of life are no longer valid. Like we've been through all this stuff. We can't continue on the way we have as Americans. These are Americans who had been to Europe as well to fight that war. Europe, they found, was a lot more, how do I put this politely? Free. It was more liberated. There weren't as strong rules against drinking as there are here. And trying to think of a way to put this delicately. There were more sexual opportunities in Europe. I'm sorry, but it's true. So one of the other reasons why they had a rough time being in America was they had experienced a culture that was a lot more fun, a lot more loose, if you will. And then they came back to America. It was like, nope, shut it down. No fun ever. Okay? Because of this, they often believe that there's a loss of meaning in human existence. They think the world is a moral wasteland. Pausing so people can get at least one thing, and I'll review it at the end as well. Looks like most of you have tapped out something. All right, cool. This is review from last time. So the first slide was fedoras on modernism. This one's mine. Both equally good. So a couple key questions for modernism. If you prefer to write one of the questions, you can write that for your answers too. So one of them is, what is the American dream? Can everyone reach it? That's definitely a question of the book, Great Gatsby. Another question that they thought about as they wrote is good writing based in reality? A lot of times narrators in modernism are not reliable narrators. They're either biased or they withhold things. And the modernistic writers tried to write it that way on purpose because they felt that's what real people were like. Real people lie. Real people hide stuff. All right. And then last question for modernism is, how important is it for writing to reflect or examine societal issues? They believed it was very important. They believed it was really important to have writing that showed how rough life can be. I'm going to pause a moment and then we're going to move on to actually reading the book. Okay. So at this point, I'm going to switch over to Schoology so I can use the book with you. If you haven't had a chance, see this little note? It says download to Notability. Go ahead and do that, please, if you haven't had a chance. And while you do that, I'm going to walk around to see if anyone has a question on the first part, or if you want me to check your first answer for modernism. Right, so go ahead and download that to Notability. This way you'll have the book with you always. I also have paper copies if you prefer. Let me know. And to be honest, I'm also kind of checking to see if Schoology is working with all the testing. Does that mean it is on your Notability? Huh. Okay, so I'm hearing, looks like from a couple people that it's not downloading. All right, well, we'll just use it off of the screen then. We'll just have to go through Schoology. I will, as promised, preview this with you, so I'll get you started. Appreciate the info, that helps. All right, does anyone want a paper copy? Looking like no. Need to move so you can charge that? Go for it, no worries. All right. Kimlet. The book is, see week 3 at the bottom there? Click on that. And then it should be, yep, there you go. All right. Looks like we're ready for the reading part. So I believe I'm getting you to page 14 today. And I warned you yesterday that one problem with this book, I love it, but one problem is chapter 1's kind of slow. Even Fitzgerald thought that. So if you think it's kind of slow, he agrees with you, the author does. He wanted to fix chapter 1, but he ran out of time before it got published. All right. So if you'd read with me, that would be helpful. In my younger and more vulnerable years, my father gave me some advice that I've been turning over in my mind ever since. Whenever you feel like criticizing anyone, he told me, just remember that all the people in this world haven't had the advantages that you've had. He didn't say any more, but we've always been unusually communicative in a reserved way, and I understood that he meant a great deal more than that. In consequence, I'm inclined to reserve all judgments, a habit that has opened up many curious natures to me, and also made me the victim of not a few veteran bores. The abnormal mind is quick to detect and attach itself to this quality when it appears in a normal person. And so it came about that in college, I was unjustly accused of being a politician because I was privy to the secret griefs of wild, unknown men. So in other words, folks, what Nick, and he hasn't said his name yet, but this is Nick, what Nick's telling you is he has one of those faces and one of those attitudes where people just kind of tell them all their secrets. Maybe you know someone like that. Most of the confidences were unsought. Frequently, I've feigned sleep, preoccupation, or a hostile levity when I realized by some unmistakable sign that an intimate revelation was quivering on the horizon. For the intimate revelations of young men, or at least the terms in which they express them, are usually plagiaristic and marred by obvious suppressions. Reserving judgments is a matter of infinite hope. I'm still a little afraid of missing something if I forget that, as my father snobbishly suggested, and I snobbishly repeat, A sense of the fundamental decencies is parceled out unequally at birth. The long story short, in other words, Nick really believes that some people aren't decent. They don't know how boring they are. So he tries all these different strategies to deal with it. After boasting this way of my tolerance, I come to the admission that it has a limit. Conduct may be founded on the hard rock or the wet marshes, but after a certain point, I don't care what it's founded on. When I came back from the East last autumn, I felt that I wanted the world to be in uniform and at a sort of moral attention forever. I wanted no more riotous excursions with privileged glimpses into the human heart. Only Gatsby, the man who gives his name to this book, was exempt from my reaction. Gatsby, who represented everything for which I have an unaffected scorn. If personality is an unbroken series of successful gestures, then there was something gorgeous about him. Some heightened sensitivity to the promises of life, as if he were related to one of those intricate machines that register earthquakes 10,000 miles away. This responsiveness had nothing to do with that flabby impressionability, which is dignified under the name the creative temperament. It was an extraordinary gift for hope, a romantic readiness such as I have never found in any other person, and which is not likely I shall ever find again. No, Gatsby turned out all right at the end. It's what preyed on Gatsby, what foul dust floated in the wake of his dreams, that temporarily closed out my interest in the abortive sorrows and short-winded elations of men. So he tells you all of that to give you a little hint that this book is told looking back to the past, and that he's thinking about his buddy Gatsby. My family have been prominent, well-to-do people in this Middle Western city for 3 generations. The Carraways, so now we know his last name, the Carraways are something of a clan, and we have a tradition that we've descended from the Dukes of Bullock. But the actual founder of my line was my grandfather's brother, who came here in 1851, sent a substitute to the Civil War, and started the wholesale hardware business that my father carries on today. All of those details of Nick's past are almost exactly F. Scott's past, which we'll be talking about Friday. I never saw this great uncle, but I'm supposed to look like him, with special reference to the rather hard-boiled painting that hangs in Father's office. I graduated from New Haven in 1915, just a quarter of a century after my father, and a little later I participated in that delayed Teutonic migration known as the Great War. I enjoyed the counter raids so thoroughly that I came back restless. So this is a person who enjoyed being at war. He liked the busyness of it. Instead of being the warm center of the world, the Middle West now seemed like the ragged edge of the universe. So I decided to go east and learn the bond business. Bonds are essentially banking. I'll just go simple. Everybody I knew was in the bond business, so I supposed it could support one more single man. All my aunts and uncles talked it over as if they were choosing a prep school for me, and finally said, "Why, yes," with very grave, hesitant faces. Father agreed to finance me for a year, and after various delays, I came east. Permanently, I thought, in the spring of 22. So if his father can pay for his rent, it says finance him. If his father can pay for his rent for a whole year, how is Nick's family with money? I'd agree. I'd say they're sitting pretty. I know my parents certainly could not have afforded to do that. All right. The practical thing was to find rooms in the city, but it was a warm season and I'd just left a country of wide lawns and friendly trees. So when a young man at the office suggested that we take a house together in a commuting town, it sounded like a great idea. He found the house, a weather-beaten cardboard bungalow at $80 a month. But at the last minute, the firm ordered him to Washington, and I went out to the country alone. I had a dog, at least I had him for a few days until he ran away, and an old Dodge and a Finnish woman who made my bed and cooked breakfast and muttered Finnish wisdom to herself over the electric stove. It was lonely for a day or so until one morning, some man, more recently arrived than I, stopped me on the road. "How do you get to West Egg Village?" he asked helplessly. I told him, and as I walked on, I was lonely no longer. I was a guide, a pathfinder, an original settler. He had casually conferred on me the freedom of the neighborhood. And so with the sunshine and the great bursts of leaves growing on the trees, just as things grow fast in movies, I had that familiar conviction that life was beginning over again with the summer. There was so much to read, for one thing, and so much fine health to be pulled down out of the young, breath giving air. I bought a dozen volumes on banking and credit and investment securities, and they stood on my shelf in red and gold like new money from the mint, promising to unfold the shining secrets that only Midas and Morgan and Mechanus knew. And I had the high intention of reading many other books besides. I was rather literary in college. One year I wrote a series of very solemn and obvious editorials for the Yale News. And now I was going to bring back all such things into my life and become again that most limited of all specialists, the well-rounded man. This isn't just an epigram. Life is more successfully looked at from a single window, after all. It was a matter of chance that I should have rented a house in one of the strangest communities in North America. So here comes some more of those exposition details, setting details are going to be here. It was on that slender, riotous island which extends itself due east of New York, and where there are, among other natural curiosities, two unusual formations of land. 20 miles from the city, a pair of enormous eggs, identical in contour and separated only by a courtesy bay, jut out into the most domesticated body of salt water in the Western Hemisphere, the great wet barnyard of Long Island Sound. They are not perfect ovals. Like the egg in the Columbus story, they're both crushed flat at the contact end. But their physical resemblance must be a source of perpetual confusion to the gulls that fly overhead. To the wingless, a more arresting phenomenon is their dissimilarity in every particular except shape and size. I don't know about y'all, but the first time I read this book, I got really confused about the egg part. I was like, what? Why is he talking about eggs? He's just trying to explain to you that in this book, the main setting, there's going to be a piece of land here, piece of land here, and in the middle is water. That's all he's trying to tell you. I lived at West Egg. So like most places where there's two spots, there's one part that's kind of rich and one part that's not. So I lived at West Egg, the less fashionable of the two. So this is a most superficial tag to express the bizarre and not a little sinister contrast between them. My house was at the very tip of the egg, only 50 yards from the Sound. The Sound is the water, and squeezed between two huge places that rented for 12 or 15,000 a season. The one on my right was a colossal affair by any standard. It was a factual imitation of some Hotel de Ville in Normandy, with a tower on one side, spanking new under a thin beard of raw ivy, and a marble swimming pool, and more than 40 acres of lawn and garden. It was Gatsby's mansion. Or rather, as I didn't know Mr. Gatsby, it was a mansion inhabited by a gentleman of that name. My own house was an eyesore, but it was a small eyesore, and it had been overlooked. So I had a view of the water, a partial view of my neighbor's lawn, and the consoling proximity of millionaires, all for $80 a month. Across the courtesy bay, the white palaces of fashionable East Egg glittered along the water, and the history of the summer really begins on the evening I drove over there to have dinner with the Tom Buchanans. Daisy was my second cousin once removed, and I'd known Tom in college. Just after the war, I spent 2 days with them in Chicago. So we already got our first detail about Daisy. You need at least two. One is that she and Nick are cousins. A lot of times people think they're going out, but they're not. They're cousins. Her husband, among various physical accomplishments, had been one of the most powerful ends that ever played football at New Haven, a national figure in a way. One of those men who reached such an acute limited excellence at 21 that everything afterwards savors of anticlimax. His family were enormously wealthy. Even in college, his freedom with money was a matter for reproach. But now he'd left Chicago and come east in a fashion that rather took your breath away. For instance, he brought down a string of polo ponies from Lake Forest. It was hard to realize that a man in my own generation was wealthy enough to do that. Why they came east? I don't know. They had spent a year in France for no particular reason, and then drifted here and there unrestfully wherever people played polo and were rich together. "This was a permanent move," said Daisy over the telephone, but I didn't believe it. I had no sight into Daisy's heart, but I felt that Tom would drift on forever, seeking a little wistfully for the dramatic turbulence of some irrecoverable football game. And so it happened that on a warm, windy evening, I drove over to East Egg to see two old friends whom I scarcely knew at all. Their house was even more elaborate than I expected, a cheerful red and white Georgian colonial mansion overlooking the bay. The lawn started at the beach and ran toward the front door for a quarter of a mile, jumping over sundials and brick walls and burning gardens. Finally, when it reached the house, drifting up the side in bright vines as though from the momentum of its run. The front was broken by a line of French windows, glowing now with reflected gold and wide open to the warm, windy afternoon. And Tom Buchanan in riding clothes was standing with his legs apart on the front porch. He had changed since his New Haven years. Now he was a sturdy, straw-haired man of 30, with a rather hard mouth and a supercilious manner. Supercilious means he thinks he's the boss of everything, basically. Two shining, arrogant eyes had established dominance over his face and gave him the appearance of always leaning aggressively forward. Not even the effeminate swank of his riding clothes could hide the enormous power of that body. He seemed to fill those glistening boots until he strained the top lacing, and you could see a great pack of muscles shifting when his shoulder moved under his thin coat. It was a body capable of enormous leverage, a cruel body. His speaking voice, a gruff, husky tenor, added to the impression of fractiousness he conveyed. There was a touch of paternal contempt in it, even toward people he liked, and there were men at New Haven who hated his guts. "Now, don't think my opinion on these matters is final," he seemed to say, "just because I'm stronger and more of a man than you are." We were in the same senior society, and while we were never intimate, he means friends. I always had the impression that he approved of me and wanted me to like him with some harsh, defiant wishfulness of his own. We talked for a few minutes on the sunny porch. "I've got a nice place here," he said, his eyes flashing about restlessly. Turning me around by one arm, he moved a broad, flat hand along the front vista, including in its sweep a sunken Italian garden, a half-acre of deep, pungent roses, and a snub-nosed motorboat that bumped the tide offshore. "It belonged to Domain, the oil man." He turned me around again, politely and abruptly. "We'll go inside." We walked through a high hallway into a bright, rosy-colored space, fragilely bound into the house by French windows at either end. The windows were ajar and gleaming white against the fresh grass outside that seemed to grow a little way into the house. A breeze blew through the room, blew curtains in at one end and out the other like pale flags, twisting them up toward the frosted wedding cake of the ceiling, and then rippled over the wine-colored rug, making a shadow on it as wind does on the sea. The only completely stationary object in the room was an enormous couch on which two young women were buoyed up as though upon an anchored balloon. They were both in white, and their dresses were rippling and fluttering as if they had just been blown back in after a short flight around the house. I must have stood for a few moments listening to the whip and snap of the curtains and the groan of a picture on the wall. Then there was a boom as Tom Buchanan shut the rear windows, and the cot wind died out about the room, and the curtains and the rugs and the two young women ballooned slowly to the floor. So he doesn't mean literally that these women were floating. He's just describing how windy and how light everything is, so it feels that way. The younger of the two was a stranger to me. She was extended full length at her end of the divan, completely motionless and with her chin raised a little, as if she were balancing something on it, which was quite likely to fall. If she saw me out of the corner of her eye, she gave no hint of it. Indeed, I was almost surprised into murmuring an apology for having disturbed her by coming in. The other girl, Daisy, made an attempt to rise. She leaned slightly forward with a conscientious expression. Then she laughed, an absurd, charming little laugh, and I laughed too and came forward into the room. I'm paralyzed with happiness." She laughed again as if she had said something very witty, and held my hand for a moment, looking up into my face, promising that there was no one in the world she so much wanted to see. That was a way she had. She hinted in a murmur that the surname of the balancing girl was Baker. I've heard it said that Daisy's murmur was only to make people lean toward her, an irrelevant criticism that made it no less charming. At any rate, Miss Baker's lips fluttered. She nodded at me almost imperceptibly, and then quickly tipped her head back again. The object she was balancing had obviously tottered a little and given her something of a fright. So she's not literally balancing something on the edge of her nose. He's trying to show that she's kind of snobby because her nose is so high up in the air. Again, a sort of apology arose to my lips. Almost any exhibition of complete self-sufficiency draws a stunned tribute from me. I looked back at my cousin, who began to ask me questions in her low, thrilling voice. It was the kind of voice that the ear follows up and down, as if each speech is an arrangement of notes that will never be played again. Her face was sad and lovely with bright things in it, bright eyes and a bright, passionate mouth, but there was an excitement in her voice that men who had cared for her found difficult to forget. A singing compulsion, a whispered listen, a promise that she had done gay, exciting things just a while since. Of course, she's not that interesting. This is the version of the word gay that means happy. And that there were gay, exciting things hovering in the next hour. I told her how I'd stopped off in Chicago for a day on my way east, and how a dozen people had sent their love through me. Do they miss me? She cried ecstatically. Whole town is desolate. All the cars have the left rear wheel painted black as a mooring wreath, and there's a persistent wail all night long along the North Shore. Oh, gorgeous. Let's go back, Tom, tomorrow. Then she added irrelevantly, you ought to see the baby. I'd like to. She's asleep. She's 2 years old. Haven't you ever seen her? Never. Well, you ought to see her. She's Tom Buchanan, who had been hovering restlessly about the room, stopped and rested his hand on my shoulder. What you doing, Nick? I'm a bond man. Who with? I told him. Never heard of them, he remarked decisively. This annoyed me. You will, I answered shortly. You will if you stay in the East. Oh, I'll stay in the East, don't you worry, he said, glancing back at Daisy and then back at me, as if he were alert for something more. I'd be a goddamned fool to live anywhere else. At this point, Miss Baker said, absolutely, with such suddenness that I started. It was the first word she uttered since I came into the room. Evidently, it surprised her as much as it did me, for she yawned and with a series of rapid, deft movements stood up into the room. I'm stiff, she complained. I've been lying on that sofa for as long as I can remember. Don't look at me, Daisy retorted. I've been trying to get you to New York all afternoon. No thanks, said Miss Baker to the 4 cocktails just in from the pantry. I am absolutely in training. Her host looked at her incredulously. You are? He took down his drink as if it were a drop in the bottom of a glass. How you ever get anything done is beyond me. I looked at Miss Baker, wondering what it was she got done. I enjoyed looking at her. She was a slender, small-breasted girl with an erect carriage, which she accentuated by throwing her body backward at the shoulders like a young cadet. Her gray, sun-strained eyes looked back at me with polite, reciprocal curiosity out of a wan, charming, discontented face. It occurred to me now that I had seen her, a picture of her somewhere. You live in West Egg, she remarked contemptuously. I know somebody there. I don't know a single. You must know Gatsby. Gatsby? Demanded Daisy. What Gatsby? Before I ever could reply that he was my neighbor, dinner was announced. Wedging his tense arm imperatively under mine, Tom Buchanan compelled me from the room as though he were moving a checker to another square. Slenderly, languidly, their hands set lightly on their hips, the 2 young women preceded us out into a rosy-colored porch, open toward the sunset, where 4 candles flickered on the table in the diminishing wind. Why candles? Objected Daisy, frowning. She snapped them out with her fingers. In 2 weeks, it'll be the longest day of the year. She looked at all of us radiantly. Do you always watch for the longest day of the year and then miss it? I always watch for the longest day in the year and miss it. We ought to plan something, yawned Miss Baker, sitting down at the table as if she were getting into bed. All right, said Daisy. What do we plan? She turned to me helplessly. What do people plan? Before I could answer, her eyes fastened with an odd expression on her little finger. Look, she complained. I heard it. We all looked. The knuckle was black and blue. You did it, Tom, she said accusingly. I know you didn't mean to, but you did do it. That's what I get for marrying a brute of a man, a great big hulking physical specimen of a— I hate that word, hulking, objected Tom crossly, even in kidding. Hulking, insisted Daisy. Sometimes she and Miss Baker talked at once, unobtrusively and with a bantering inconsequence that was never quite chatter, that was as cool as their white dresses and their impersonal eyes in the absence of all desire. They were here, and they accepted Tom and me, making only a polite, pleasant effort to entertain or to be entertained. They knew that presently dinner would be over, and a little later the evening too would be over and casually put away. It was sharply different from the West, where an evening was hurried from phase to phase toward its close in a continually disappointed anticipation, or else in sheer nervous dread of the moment itself. You make me feel uncivilized, Daisy, I confessed on my second glass of corky but rather impressive claret. Can't you talk about crops or something? I meant nothing in particular by this remark, but it was taken up in an unexpected way. So tomorrow, or not tomorrow, Thursday's your work day. Friday, I'll continue with this part. So Tom's going to start going on about how civilization's going to pieces. And like a lot of rich white folk, okay, maybe this is my opinion, like a lot of rich white folk, he's going to blame all of society's problems on other races. So Tom is quite racist. Not a great thing. So let's show you, as promised, some of these answers, if you didn't get them yet. So one of the most important or interesting things about modernism could be, if I can get this thing to work while I'm showing you. If not, we'll do answers later. All right, there we go. So one of the things you could have written about modernism is, so what is the American dream and how do you get it? And I'll leave the other one for you. Exposition details. What first things does the reader learn about the setting, the protagonist, and the point of view? So if you have an author, does anyone remember who's saying I and me and telling you everything? What's that perspective called? Yep, you're correct. You're both right. So you can either write first person point of view or POV if you prefer. Narrator. Both would be equally correct on a quiz. So if you didn't know, I don't remember what it's called, you just go Nick's telling the story, you're good to go. Okay, and then a second thing that happened, if you're a student who's struggling to think of that, I would talk about the setting. What does he tell you about the setting? Is it a poor neighborhood or a rich one? All right, character details. So Daisy, detail 1 and why you chose it. I'm going to write she, and of course you can take these answers. She murmurs, or I'm going to say she talks quietly. Same thing. She talks quietly so people lean in and listen. And then I have to say why I chose it. I chose this because it seems manipulative. So to me, that shows right away that Daisy's manipulative. She will get what she wants out of people. Okay, and then we'll leave off with a character detail about Tom. And then I'll give the rest of the time for you folks to do what you need to do. So Tom, detail 1 and why I chose it. I'm going to say he is described as a hulking specimen. So I'll have to go back later and find the page for that. I did a student last year just wrote, he's a big dude, which true. It's a big ex-football player. American football, not European. All right. So I'm going to leave that up for you folks so you can get that. And then you have the rest of the time to fill in the other answers. If you wish to talk to one another while you do that, if you want to share your answers, I have no problem with that. You can go ahead and do that. So feel free to get up and move and sit by somebody. Share your answers. I've also had students in the past who wanted me to check their answers right away. I have no problem with that either.